Hello again and welcome back humans, gentle birds, and distinguished lizards. Once again, we delve into a video that is not about writing advice. Who would take writing advice from a Komodo dragon anyway? Speaking of a Komodo dragon, for this week, I will be talking about the little lessons I learned about writing that I wish I knew at the start. As I may have mentioned before, I had no mentors in writing. I was self-taught. I absorbed advice and instruction from whatever sources were available to me, discarding ones that were either bad or did not work for my creative paradigm, but most of the important lessons I learned by doing. But that methodology means that sometimes, things that I should have known about at the start are things I only learn later on. While I do not regret the road I took, I do wish I knew about some things earlier to make that journey easier on myself. Yes, this is basically a list video. I apologize for the inconvenience. Number 8, the Oxford comma. This one is relatively minor, as these things go. I was never taught about the Oxford comma. My formal schooling and informal self-teaching never caught it. It was not until some time after I started writing fanfiction that I realized the Oxford comma existed. Once I knew what it was, however, it was like a revelation. Suddenly sentences where I had to itemize things no longer looked awkward to read and sometimes difficult to properly understand. There are some people who will tell you the Oxford comma is unnecessary. Others might tell you that it is not part of their particular style guide. While this is not a writing advice channel, I will note that such people are wrong. If you are listing down 3 or more distinct items in one sentence, you should use an Oxford comma. As a writer, I have broken many rules of grammar. This is not one of them. Number 7, realism is not the same as believability. One of the things that many people seem to obsess over no matter the genre is realism. Why, I am unsure. I always thought the point of fiction was to help us get away from the crushing banality of our daily real lives, so excess realism seems to me like something we should all be working to avoid. However, over the years, I have come to realize that when people say they want things to be realistic, that is not what they mean. What they actually want is believability. And this is not the same thing. Realism is things playing out as they would in real life, which most people assume to be reasonable and bound by certain rules and limitations. If you jump, you will eventually land. Believability is something else. Believability is whether or not events in a story sound plausible given the context that is the story itself. It does not need to be bound by the limits of what would happen in real life. No one reading a superhero comic questions whether Superman can fly. A man flying is not realistic, but in the context of Superman and the superhero genre, it is believable. Fiction should be believable within its context. But it is not required to be realistic. Learning this has both increased the value of research in my writing and made things much easier for me. Number 6, don't let genre tie you down. As someone who writes fantasy, I understand this to an acceptable degree. Every genre has its own set of expectations that people have when they hear it. Science fiction always seems to draw images of space, interstellar conflicts, and alien life. Cyberpunk always has cybernetics, corporations with more power than national governments, and everything being exploited in the name of profit. Epic fantasy always has a powerful dark lord and the world is in peril due to his machinations. Romance always has a likable if somewhat bland female protagonist and a strong, intense male counterpart who often has more personality. Except genre is not an absolute. Conan encountered an elephant alien in one of his adventures, and there is no arguing Conan the Barbarian is firmly in the sword and sorcery subgenre. Captain America the Winter Soldier is a superhero movie but it plays out and captures the mood and feel of a spy thriller. Star Wars has endless worlds and space opera trappings, and one of the major conflicts in the galaxy is a philosophical debate between two opposing sects of space wizards. For me, the only thing that should stop me from mixing genre elements and conventions together is whether or not I can make them believable in the context of the fiction. I can figure out the genre labels after the story is written. Number 5, take notes. I cannot stress enough how important I find keeping notes to be. Even if I never make concrete plans for what I write, I try to keep notes of what my ideas are and anything that might be good to include in a story. Notes can be for anything from ideas for a novel, a concept that I want to explore, the seed of an idea for a fictional setting, or even just a single line that I think I should work into a work of fiction at some point. Notes can also be useful for storing the random facts that you come across. These may not appear to be worth keeping to others, but I personally find that having an assortment of facts on hand can help build believability in small ways. In my case, I like keeping notes handy on various historical and scientific facts because these are the most likely for me to make use of. And taking notes is easier than ever before thanks to modern technology. I remember when I had to manually transfer notes I took on napkins or random pieces of paper to something sturdier. I eventually learned to keep a notebook and pen handy. Things are so much more convenient these days. And I never have to try to decipher my own handwriting ever again. Number 4. A simple vocabulary is fine. One recurring misconception I see in writers just starting out, and one that I had myself, is that you need a fancy, smart-sounding vocabulary to be good at writing. That you couldn't just call a garden what it was, but instead call it a solarium or conservatory. That whenever you had a choice between a word that was simple and a word that was sesquipedalian and both had the same meaning, you were supposed to pick the longer one. This is a mistake. The fact is that simple works better because it's easier to understand. When writing, you want your words to be understandable. You want to convey your ideas and images in a clear, concise way. Using big words may make you feel smarter, but they do not help you get your point across most of the time. I try to use simple words when possible, ones that people can easily grasp and won't have them reaching for the dictionary as they read. Of course, there are exceptions to this. There seems to be exceptions to every rule. Sometimes you do want to use the fancy word because it fits the context. Maybe the speaker is someone who likes using those words, for whatever reason. Maybe the story is set in a time and place where using plain language is considered uncouth or the mark of the poorly educated. Or if the fancy word has no simple equivalent, such as a technical term or a foreign word whose meaning requires context if forced into translation. But in general, keeping the language simple is often the better idea. Number 3. Not all worlds are built like Middle-earth. Most people are aware of the mind-boggling level of detail that went into the fantasy setting that is Middle-earth. It is a rich tapestry of a world with its own languages, poetry, cultures, values, and customs. It is a fantasy setting with a long and storied history that informs so much of what we, as readers, experience in the stories. It is one of the most developed fictional worlds out there and one of the most coherent. There is a good reason why so many authors attempt to emulate it in terms of depth and detail, even if they step away from the themes, ideas, and elements of that world. But as excellent as the work of Tolkien is, it is not absolutely necessary for other authors. I don't recall when or how I first discovered that the world inhabited by the original Conan the Barbarian stories is not a vast, detailed world. Instead, the author just wrote down an essay that covered what he considered the important elements to keep in mind. After that, he just added as he went along in writing the stories. It is a bare-bones origin for a world that was the backdrop for one of the most influential and beloved sword and sorcery characters. And it showed me that I do not necessarily need a hyper-detailed fictional setting to write great stories. I know I need to do at least a little and fulfill certain key functions of a story world, but it is possible to get away with not detailing every little thing. This is something I consider an important lesson, since sometimes knowing when to stop world building is important. But this is a topic that probably deserves a more detailed treatment later on, so I will not go any deeper. Number 2. Your first draft is mostly bad. For me, this was likely the most undermentioned thing as I was learning how to write. I don't know why, but it took me years to actually hear this from someone who had experience and an authoritative voice. For a long time, I just assumed that I was not doing a very good job because my first drafts were terrible and the people I talked to never seemed to think too much about editing. Being told that the first draft is typically bad and always needs more work was a massive revelation that I was angry no one around me told me or realized. For me, understanding that no first draft is ever going to be perfect helped me relax. It took pressure off my chest and let me understand that while I should still write a draft at the very best I can, it is never going to be at the level of polish and style that it is in my head. That comes out in the editing process. Understanding this made me feel less pressure in writing first drafts, because I no longer felt a need to get it completely right the first time and that anything less was a failure to produce a proper manuscript. This does not mean I should be lazy and put together a bad first draft. All it means is that I do not need to pressure myself into getting it right the first time. It can always be improved later. And finally, number 8, don't be afraid to make mistakes. No one is perfect. Not even your favorite author. Or yourself. There will always be a mistake to correct, some error no one caught, or a weakness that could have been fixed to make a stronger narrative. Humans, birds, and lizards all make mistakes. It is inherent to our nature and possibly coded into the laws of probability. This is something I have come to accept over the years, and it is something that does not usually lead to me cutting a writing project off before it finished. I found that it is important to not fear making a mistake. I should not wonder if it is wrong to use the plot structure of a buddy cop movie in a romance story, or ponder whether or not it's possible to write an entire novel with neither dialogue nor internal narration, or any of a number of other things that I eventually realized were mistakes. Or just things I would not be able to write in a satisfactory manner. Mistakes are part of writing. Sometimes I can adapt them for later use. But most of the time, I find that they will end up being good practice for how to fix things after I get the first draft done. And that is finally the end of this list. Hopefully the format was not too off-putting and did not sound too much like advice. In any case, thank you for staying to the end. If you like what I do, consider subscribing and doing all those other things that draw the attention of the almighty algorithm. If you are feeling bored enough, maybe even check the description for links to my books. Until next time, this has been your resident Komodo dragon.